Hello, everyone, and welcome to the CDFA Hotline. My name is Kristen Shearin. I am the Director of Education for the Institute of Divorce Financial Analysts. I'm also an attorney, a divorce financial analyst, and a certified family financial mediator. And I'm really excited to be here with you today with my co-host, who is Michele Laws from Divorce Dollars. Michele has a BA in business with a specialization in finance. She received certifications as a certified divorce financial analyst from the Institute of Divorce Financial Analysts. She is also a certified valuation analyst and a master analyst of financial forensics, both from the National Association of Certified Valuators and Analysts. So we are very excited to have Michele here with us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
We thought we would answer some questions that you guys had sent in today. So just as a reminder, just want that this discussion is it is not legal advice. It's not financial advice. Every single divorce situation is different. So what we're doing today is we're going to give you some general information. You should not rely on this completely in order to make decisions about your case. I really cannot stress that enough. It's really, really important to understand that every single case is different, and there could be some small nuance about your case that makes these fact patterns a little bit different in your particular situation. So the goal for this show today is to give you general information and to point you towards resources. It is not a substitute for legal advice, and it is not a substitute for financial advice. So please, if you need to seek, if you're going through a divorce, you should seek advice that is specific to your situation, and that's very, very important. That being said, we are happy to help you navigate this a complex world of divorce, and so we've got hopefully some great information to share with you today. And what we're going to do is we're just going to answer some questions that some people have written in, and Michele, if it's okay with you, we'll just dive right in.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. Great. Okay, so our first question today is, I am getting divorced at 52. We have big 401ks and IRAs. What is the smartest way to split retirement accounts without huge tax penalties?
I would say that's a very common question that I know I receive a lot from clients, because everyone feels when they divide, they're automatically taxed, when actually that's not what happens. When you're dividing assets that are such as retirement between spouses, there aren't any tax penalties. And matter of fact, there's no taxation at all when that occurs. When you have that, it's only taxed on distribution. So in other words, if you were to take money out of the account and put it into your own checking account to spend, that's when you have tax, or that's when you have penalties. In that type of situation, it is best to have someone help you analyze to see which you should take. Sometimes there might be an advantageous way for you to take a 401k. Depending on some needs that you have in your particular situation, sometimes it's better for you to take the IRA. Sometimes it's better to take a portion of each. Again, as Kristen said, each circumstance is different. So analysis of your particular needs and what you should take is very important.
Yeah, thank you so much. That you could not be more correct. This is probably one of the biggest things that we deal with in divorce. And the only thing that I would add to that is pay real close attention to whether or not your IRAs are Roth IRAs or traditional IRAs, because those have different types of taxation, and they're taxed very differently, and their values are not the same. So that's something that you really want to pay attention to. And if you're not sure which ones are Roth IRAs or traditional IRAs, then that's where you need to enlist an expert to help you figure that out.
Right. And one more thing to add, because she mentioned she was 52, some of those assets might be some premarital assets. Some of them may be completely marital contributions. So analysis of which might be a part of each account may be important, since you are very young. And if you're mentioning they're large, there might be a component of premarital contributions.
Very, very true. Okay, our next question is about debt. So we have a lot of credit card debt, but most of it is in my husband's name. Am I still responsible for any of it after the divorce?
I would first and foremost say that's probably the position of your attorney, of how your attorney feels about that debt. It's different in every jurisdiction, and attorneys typically want to know, how did the debt get there? Were they cash advances used for gambling? Was it money used for a potential new significant other? Was it family expense? That might make a difference of how the attorney would want to position of who's taking what. Ultimately and generally, it's marital debt. And what we look at when we analyze is first and foremost of what's the position of your attorney? What are they wanting it to look like and be positioned for either side of you? The other is who can afford to pay the debt? If you're only going to be living off of child support and a form of maintenance or spousal support, and he has a very high income potential, he might actually receive the majority of the debt because he has the ability to pay, which you may not.
Yeah, and what I like to try to do, at least in situations where we have the ability to do it, is I really like to pay off all of the marital debt because you're looking to end your relationship and put it behind you and move forward. And so it's really challenging for the person that gets saddled with the debt, because the debt was in their name. Oftentimes that happens because there's no marital assets to pay it off. But where there are marital assets that we have the ability to pay off marital debt, I like to do that. And to circle back earlier to what you said about whether or not the debt, what was it used for? What we like to say is, was it used for a marital purpose? Was it used for something that benefited the marriage? Now, that doesn't mean that you had to agree with it. Even if you didn't agree with it, you could likely be saddled with it. But it did need to benefit the marriage in some way, shape, or form. Whether that was, you know, buying things for the house or buying things for the kids, so you don't have to necessarily agree with all the purchases to be responsible for half of the debt. But as long as it benefited the marriage in some way, shape, or form, it's likely going to be marital. The only situations really that you're going to have something where a debt is not going to be marital would be debt that was incurred prior to the marriage. And some student loans, a lot of student loans are not going to be marital. Some student loans can be marital, but for the majority, student loans are not going to be marital debt. And you have a lot of college loans, college plus loans, things like that, where you've signed on behalf of your children and you have that debt. So again, they're all very, very different. And whether or not it's marital debt or separate debt can really turn on a very small fact. And so that's where you really need to go and engage a professional if you have a question about something like that, to look at it, or also to get the professional to get you the credit card statements so that you actually can look through them and see what the funds were spent on. So if there is a lot of debt, don't just automatically assume that you're responsible for it. I would certainly at least take a look at those statements and see what that was. And are there any red flags in there? Also, a lot of times there's ways to take cash advances and open other accounts, or to buy assets that could be marital that you purchased with marital debt. So, what happened? How did that debt incur is a really, really important question if you have this concern. Okay, our next question is, my husband has a pension from his 30 years at a utility company. How can I find out if I'm entitled to part of it?
I would say first and foremost, it's going to be calculations and research. And what I mean by that is, how long were you married to him during those 30 years, which he worked for the utility company? If you were married the entire time, it's most likely going to be entire marital division of that pension. If you were only married to him, let's say for 15 years of his 30, there's a special calculation that we as CDFAs and other professionals do called a coverture fraction. In some jurisdictions, they have something like, for example, called the Hunt formula we have here in Illinois, or other areas where we do a specific calculation of what percentage of that entire pension is marital and subject to division versus what portion would be his from a premarital perspective. And from the research side, pensions have something called a summary plan description, or SPD. This is something that you would want to know if you're going to the settlement table, or even if you're going into trial. You want to find out the specifics of the pension. You want to see if it has a component called shared interest or separate interest. You may make a determination after finding out the details of the pension if you might want to take another asset. For example, a shared interest means that when that pension is divided and they receive a special document called a quadro, that will say that depending on when he retires will depend on when you can take money. A separate interest means you have your own clock going. If you want to take it at an applicable age, you can do that whether or not he's still working another 5, 10, 12 years. So knowing that information, both from a calculation of what percentage are you entitled to, as well as what are the details of the pension, you would really need to know both of those pieces of information.
Yeah, and pensions can be very, very different, and pensions can also change. So what were terms in a pension are not necessarily the terms that will remain in that pension forever. So it's really important, like you said, to get a hold of that document and read it, see exactly what the terms are. Are there cost of living adjustments? Are there other things in that pension that would be important for you to know when you're deciding whether or not you want to take it? And in this particular situation, your husband works at a utility company, but there are other types of pensions that come with different types of benefits. Include some even, include a health benefits and some additional things that you might want to be aware of. That you make sure that you put those into the document, into your settlement agreement, so that you ensure that you retain those rights.
Agree. And that document is important. One other thing to add is I've had a few cases over the years where once he passed away, the pension stopped for her. And unless that document was read in advance, they would have been without that pension, or they would have had to have another concept, think outside the box type, where they maybe had a life insurance in place if he was insurable or something else to make sure the pension was protected.
All right. Our next question. Oh, this is a good one. I'm terrified about budgeting after divorce. How can a divorce financial analyst help me figure out if I'll be okay living on my own?
I would say that is the question I know I get most often because it's a real fear. It's a change for them. So, in a very general answer, would be start by looking at what have the past 12 months of your expenses been. Then you want to consider what are new expenses that you're going to be assuming that you hadn't had in those previous 12 months, as well as which ones are dropping off. You want to get a handle on where's your outflow going to go. In addition, you want to look at what is your new income going to be? Are you receiving child support? Are you receiving some form of spousal support or maintenance, which we're going to be able to pay those expenses with? So that's most important. What happened in the past? What's going to happen in the future? What do we have as future income? Then we want to look and see, do we have a surplus? Do we have a negative cash flow situation going on where you're going to have to live on a credit card? Or are we pretty close to a zero budget? When that happens, we're going to look and see what the surplus, did we forget some expenses? If we have them all accounted for, now we have a savings we just made for you without even realizing it. If we have a negative cash flow, we need to figure out where's it going to come from. Potentially you received an asset in the divorce, which you can draw off of by means of interest or dividends, possibly to be able to fund that negative cash flow. If not, it might be something else that needs to be adjusted in the assets. And once you complete this type of exercise, this is one portion of a financial plan that you would have put together that now you have an idea of what's coming in, what's going out. You can do some analysis on what it looks like in the short term, couple of years, long term, 5 and 7 years. And if you work with an advisor such as myself, we're going to naturally go in and update that plan every year to make sure you're on track. So that's how CDFAs help in the beginning of this process. And then a financial advisor can also help on the back end of keeping you in that place you were looking to go.
The other thing CDFAs can help you with is figuring out exactly how to make that budget. A lot of times, oh, go create a budget. It can be really overwhelming for somebody that has no idea what their expenses are, or has no idea what types of things to include in a budget. And so because we do this all of the time, we have a list of things that people generally spend money on. And because we do it so often, we have a good idea of what a baseline for those expenses are. And we can adjust them accordingly, depending on your lifestyle. But we can get started very quickly and very easily because we do it so much, and so we can make this process really painless for you. And if you really can't handle it, you can give us the statements and we can do it for you. If you're financially savvy and you can do it yourself, that's great. Then you can utilize us to check and to do some checks and balances to make sure that, again, your budget is reasonable compared to other people that have similar incomes and lifestyles. And so we can just streamline that process and take away a lot of the stress in terms of what that budget looks like. And then that's really where you start with how much do I need. But for a lot of spouses, you haven't seen the utility bill, you haven't seen the phone bill, you don't know what it costs to mow the lawn. And so these are the things that we can help you with if you're feeling overwhelmed. All right, next question. This is something that I am in the world of at the moment. But we agreed on 50-50 custody, but who pays for college later? Should we be setting up a legal agreement now? And as someone that has two children in college, yes, you should, if it is at all possible. So, what are your thoughts on that, Michele?
I agree. I think every situation is different and it's going to depend on the age of the children. If you have very young children or 3, 5, we have a long way off till college is going to be upon them. So something like that, it might be better to reserve it. And as income changes for both parties, it could be later assessed on who's going to pay for college, but maybe put in some caveats of how that's going to be addressed and who's going to pay for potential things going forward as far as any litigation or court documents. If they're middle-aged high school, or I'm sorry, middle age going into high school, in any cases I've mediated or assisted with, I kind of leave it up to the parties. If it's been a really contentious situation, it might be better off writing it in because then they might be tied up in court for 4 more years and college year 1 is already ongoing when the decision is made. If it's a very cooperative, more likely the parties might just reserve it for a few years or and put in some language of how they're going to attack it in maybe junior or senior year. If they're about ready to go to college, write it in.
So, a couple things I like to do every time I see this situation. One, just so you know, a lot of people are scared to sign up for college expenses in the future when they don't know what their financial situation will be. And I do understand that. And I think that that's a common fear. And so if your spouse refuses to enter an agreement where they pay for college, that doesn't make them a horrible parent or a horrible spouse. I think that that is a reasonable fear to have. Second, I see a lot of situations where one spouse may be so concerned about this that the other spouse then uses it as a tool for negotiation. And you wind up bidding against yourself for your children. And so I would just say this is a situation where it is okay to put yourself first. If your spouse will only allocate part of your marital estate, towards these expenses, it is okay, and it might be in your best interest to go ahead and take that money for yourself, and just knowing that you can maybe be in a different financial situation by the time the kids go to college, or worst case scenario, they can take loans. But don't put yourself in a negative financial situation trying to plan for your children's future. I think I've seen that more often than I would like. So those are two really good reasons why you wouldn't want to include these in a legally binding document. That being said, there are a lot of great reasons to include it too. And it really just depends on the couple, their financial situation, how committed they are to funding um, these future college expenses. But at the same time, I think that talking to a certified divorce financial analyst and talking a little bit more about what those future expenses look like or could look like, how could we budget for it, helps you create a plan for how you're going to pay these expenses going forward. And also, it's really important to have some level of understanding about financial aid, because how you structure your agreement can absolutely impact your children's ability to receive financial aid later. And I've seen so many situations where the parents are divorced and the high earning parent won't pay for college, but the child can't qualify for a federal loan because their parent's income is too high. And so these are all kinds of things that if you understand how they work, you have an ability, at least an ability, to negotiate those terms into your separation agreement. And so that's why I think that it's worth educating yourself and talking to somebody that knows how these programs work so that you can be mindful and make the best decisions possible um, given your divorce. That being said, if it overwhelms you and you're stressed and this is too difficult for you, this is a situation where it is okay to prioritize yourself and not put yourself in a negative financial situation because you're already in a negative financial situation because you're going through a divorce. So I like to prioritize it. I like to include it in agreements when it makes sense, but not at the expense of a fair and reasonable settlement. Okay, and our last question for the day. We are trying to do a divorce without lawyers to save money. What's the biggest financial mistake people make when they DIY their divorce?
That's hard to say just the biggest because there are so many, many, many mistakes that can happen. It's kind of like I would never go try to pull a tooth on my own. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not a dentist. This is that same kind of very intense situation. It would be difficult to do on your own. I would say generally is not being educated, not being prepared of what is coming down the pike, not understanding what the assets are, how they work, and how that's going to impact someone. So what I mean by that is certain assets are taxable assets, like retirement accounts or IRAs. Certain assets have already been taxed, like a bank account, like a house. Sometimes one person takes one big lump and the other person takes another, realizing they're not really equal assets. So having some professional be able to sit down with you and figure out what you should take, it's worth the money per hour to spend for that. The other is we kind of alluded to the premarital and the non-marital assets. Sometimes those need to be calculated separately. Depending on which side of the coin you're on, you're more interested in having that work done. I would say those type of assets really need a professional to calculate and pull apart the premarital portion and the non-marital portion. And ultimately, not considering what the short-term and long-term effects of the decision you're making are going to have on your financial picture. Numbers on paper are just that. When you start combining all the pieces together, such as a budget, such as what you're going to receive, what type of spousal maintenance you're receiving and your own income, when you start putting that together in a big puzzle piece, then you can see the effect. Just seeing the numbers written down at your kitchen table with the two of you are going to be really difficult to see what kind of decision you're making and how it's going to impact your financial future.
Yeah, I really like the idea of um, the DIY process. I don't think that process has evolved to a place where I would feel comfortable ever advising anyone to utilize it. Now, could that change in the future? Yes. Now, a lot of the things that are out there have changed very dramatically in the last couple of years. The the issue that I have with them is they provide very cookie cutter solutions, and it is very rare that someone actually fits into that box. If you are one of the people that fit in that box, I think that this can be a good resource for you. But if you're not, and you're not 100% sure that you're one of these people that fits in this box, then I would be very, very reluctant to utilize these programs in a vacuum. Now, that being said, it doesn't mean you can't utilize them and also seek the assistance of professionals on the side and maybe limit the amount of money that you're spending on those professionals and limit your use of those professionals while you also utilize these box solutions. I've seen some pretty bad outcomes, and I've had quite a few people that come in and they'll want to do a consultation with me after they have already done this and after they have already signed a legally binding document, and I have to say I'm sorry, this is done, because you did not stop to spend $200, $300, $400 getting the answer to your
You're welcome. Thank you again for having me.
Thanks, Michele.